Alright, welcome back to the second part of this tutorial. Thank you for joining me again. We're going to cover a few things that we missed in the last one, but we're mostly going to be focusing on these glass rings and this text dissolve. Okay, so here's our template. Here's where we left off last time. If you don't have this, you can go ahead and download the template, and that'll get you right to this point. I'm just going to open my reference here. There's a few things we missed. We didn't do these metal rings or these horizontal and vertical bars. Then, of course, there's these glass rings and this dissolving text. I'm just going to briefly tell you what I did with the metal bars because there's nothing new here. It's just stuff that we did in the last one. I'm just going to add in a cylinder. I'm going to make sure I keyframe that. Go from -10 to 10. I'm going to make sure it's linearized so there's not an ease in and ease out. I'm going to duplicate that for a horizontal one. I'm going to parent that to an empty, and then I'm just going to duplicate it a whole bunch of times and move those keyframes around. Like I said, there's nothing new here. You can go ahead and look at the template. But for the metal rings, there actually is something new here. So I'm going to go ahead and add in a curve circle. We're going to do this with a curve, not a mesh. Now I could use a torus, but there's a reason I'm not doing that. Let me show you right here. If I add in a torus and then I size that, scale it up, and then I duplicate that for the outer ring, you can see that the thickness has changed. And the problem with trying to rescale the thickness is it's really hard to do. If I move it in the X or the Z direction, I just end up stretching it out. If I move it in the Y direction, I just end up pancaking that. So we don't get a really good way to scale down that outer ring. Now we could get around with that with a modifier called solidify, and we'll get into that later. But for now, I'm just going to use the curve circle. So now I can go to my curve properties and I can go to extrude. That's not actually what I want. That'll make it more of a cylinder. I can go down to bevel, and under depth, that'll make it a ring. Then I can change the resolution to make it a bit more round. And then if I copy that, now I can just change the depth on the second one, and I will have two rings that look similar. Now all that's left is to animate it. It gets really tricky around the 4, 3, 2 range. There's a lot going on, a lot of overlapping rings, but give it a shot, see how you do. All right, that basically takes care of all the metal parts that we need to make. Now, one last thing I want to do before we get into the glass rings is to reorientate our background. To do that, we go into the shading tab, and over here, instead of object, we change it to world. And now you can see all the nodes that we have in conjunction with our background, our environment. We're going to add 2 nodes to that so that we can rotate it. First one's going to be a texture coordinate node. So I'm going to hit Shift A and I'm going to search for that. This will just give us the information from our background. And then I'm going to plug that into a vector mapping node. So go ahead and look for mapping, and it's going to be set to vector. So now we're going to grab our object input, go ahead and plug that in, go from vector to vector. And what that's doing is it's just grabbing the information from our background, then we're transforming all that coordinate data, and then we're pushing it into our environment texture. It's a little bit backwards. In Fusion, you might put, the transform after your textures to move it around, but this is the way Blender works. So we're going to do that. I'm going to go ahead and rotate it. It's not the X or the Y, it's the Z coordinate, and I want to just put the brightest part in the back. Say maybe like 230 degrees. That looks good. So now we can move on to the funnest part of this, I think, and that's the glass rings. For this, I'm going to turn back on my text so I have a reference for size, and so I can see something through them once we turn it to glass. So I'm going to add in a cylinder. I'm going to go ahead and rotate that. I'm going to tab into edit mode, and I'm going to shift click on the 2 faces and delete them. And now I'm going to scale it down to make it more of a ring thickness. Now here's where we can get into modifiers. For this, we're going to add thickness to it by going to the modifiers tab, and I'm going to select one called solidify. So now I can go ahead and change some of my parameters. I'm going to go ahead and set the offset to 0. You can either have it in or out. I'm just going to make it in the center, and then I'm going to crank up the thickness a little bit. Let's go ahead and add in another modifier. We're going to put in multi-res. Then I can go ahead and click on subdivide, and that'll smooth it out. Now modifiers are great because they don't actually change your mesh. They kind of just build on top of it. We can turn them off and on if we need to. They don't actually change anything unless we go and hit apply. Now that will actually change your mesh. It's best to leave it just as a modifier so you can manipulate it later, but it will make the program heavier, so you're going to have to make that choice depending on how your machine's running. So if I go ahead and apply this one, and then we go to the wireframe mode, you can actually see that's actually changed the mesh now. So let's go ahead and add on one more modifier. I'm going to add in a bevel. Now here is the problem with the bevel, that it's super frustrating. If you've scaled something up, and you haven't actually applied that scale, a lot of times the bevel won't work or won't function properly. So you're going to have to hit Control A and apply scale. And now you can see that the bevel actually functions. So now speaking of scale, I'm going to scale it up to be a little bit larger because it's a little small. Again, apply your scale, change the bevel thickness to what you need it to be. One other thing I'm going to do with this is I'm going to add in a little bit of curve to it. So I'm going to go tab into the edit mode, and I can hit A to select everything because we just have the single face. Another way you can do it is if you have multiple geometries, you can go ahead and hit Alt and left click, and that'll grab a loop around whatever you have. And now I can hit Control R, and that'll put in a loop cut. And a loop cut is just like it sounds. It's going to put in a cut around loop. I can go this direction, or I can go all the way around. I'm going to go ahead and click that direction to go all the way around. I'm going to hit Escape to center it. And now I have a single piece in the middle. Now I can hold Alt click and grab that, and then I can scale that out to put in a little bit of a curve. So another way you can do this if you don't want to use the modifiers is you can go into edit mode, hit A to select everything, hit E to extrude a face, hit escape so it doesn't go anywhere, but then you are still holding that face. You can hit S to scale it down, and that'll add in some thickness. This will be an actual mesh without modifiers, and you can do it that way as well. And then you can go ahead and add in a bevel modifier if you need to. But for this, we're going to go ahead and stick with the modifier method. Okay, so now that we actually have our ring made, let's go ahead and add a material to it. So go ahead and click on it, add a material. We're actually going to have two. We're going to have an outer glass ring and an inner glass ring. So go ahead and name it. Go ahead and go back to the shading tab. We're going to go ahead and change that from world back to object. And then we're going to go ahead and create some space. Make sure you're on this rendered mode so that we can actually see through the glass. I'm doing this in the Eevee render engine so it doesn't crash your computer. You could do it in cycles too if you wanted to. All right, we're not actually going to change much here. We're actually just going to change the roughness down to like 0.05, so it's got just a hint of roughness. And then I'm going to go to the transmission. I'm just going to crank it all the way up. Cool, so now we have our glass kind of look, but we can't actually see through it. To do that, we're going to have to change a few things. So I'm going to go over to my Eevee render tab, and I'm going to turn on screen space reflections. I say that 5 times fast, my word. Screen space reflections. Okay, go ahead and open up screen space reflections, and then go ahead and turn on refraction. Now I'm going to go over to my material tab and change a few things there. I'm going to go down to settings. I'm going to change it from opaque to alpha blend so we can see through it again. And I'm going to put in screen space refractions. And nailed that one. Now we can see through it. It looks a little weird, so you might want to turn on backface culling as well. And I'm going to go ahead and change it from alpha blend to alpha hashed. There, that's looking pretty nice. There's one more thing that we can change on this back on our material node here. I'm going to go ahead and change the IQR, and I'm just going to scale that down a little bit. And now we have that beautiful glass look. But we're not quite done. Now we need to make a few more glass rings. If we look in the reference, there's actually 3. So I'm going to go ahead and make those real quick. And then I'm going to make a few changes to them. So I made that second ring. And the only problem with this is we can't actually see the second ring through the first ring. So to do that, I'm going to make a new material, we'll call it glass outer. And I'm only going to make one change to this. I'm going to turn off screen space refraction. So now we can see through the glass, we can see our text through it, but we can also see the second ring through the glass and then see through that one. As you might imagine, this took a really long time to figure out. Hit the thumbs up button, please. Moving on. One last thing to do on this glass texture before we're done is I want to add in a little bit of roughness. I don't want it to be so clean, so I'm going to go ahead and add in the nodes we did before, the vector mapping and the object coordinates. I'm going to go ahead and plug that into the normal. And then I'm going to add in a noise texture to rough it up a bit so it's not so smooth. I'm going to go ahead and change a few of these settings. I like that look. We'll go ahead and go with that. It's just changing the look. I actually want to change the surface a little bit, so I'm going to go ahead and add in a bump as well. So go ahead and add that in, Shift A, look for a bump. And I'm going to go ahead and change that from being in the normal to the height. So now it's way too strong, so I'm going to go ahead and lower it a bit till I get a look that I like. Go ahead and play with it how you want. And it will actually change if you apply the scale. So I didn't apply the scale to the other ring or to this one. If I were to do that, it'll actually change how this looks, and you'll have to change your strength accordingly. I don't want it completely flat, but I don't want it so I can't see it, so I'm just going to put on a little bit of it. All right, so now that I have that, now I just need to keyframe it, add in the extra ring, make sure it all matches my reference. It gets a little tricky to rotate things on 3 axes. Go ahead and try it. I got it as close as I could. And if you notice, you'll see the texture here. That's just the default background being reflected in it. If I go over to my rendered tab, it'll actually show the background. So in this kind of preview render, we'll have the default background. It's not a big deal. Okay, one last thing that I did notice on the glass rings, if I go through this, because I don't have screen space refractions on, it actually won't show up when it moves there. You can see that you can't see that back ring. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to duplicate that one ring, The difference with this ring that I'm going to make is I'm going to use Alt-D instead of Shift-D. If you use Shift-D, you make a copy of something. If you use Alt-D, you will make an instance of it. So if I change the size of one, it'll change the one of the other. It'll change the material for both of them if I make a difference there. Now, I want to make a different material. To do that, I'm going to go down to Material on the one I want to change. You can see there's no 2 there because they're both using the same material, so it's only counting as one instance. I need to change it from Data to Object. And now I can make a separate material for this one. And we want to fade one off and fade one on, so we're going to do what we did before. We're just going to go in, add a mix shader, add in a transparent material, and just fade between the two. Okay, now I have that working the way I want to. We can move on to the text dissolve. But one thing I forgot to do before we get to that is there are these metal rings on one that I haven't made yet. So I'm going to show you a new way to do that. Since I've made them before, I'll go ahead and show you how to bring in something that you've made in a different project and bring it into this project. For that, we just go to File, go to Append, go ahead and find the Blender file that you had that in, and then go through your collections till you find it. And then you can go ahead and bring that in. And now it's brought in a lot more than I need, so I can go ahead and delete the stuff that I don't need. And now I just have these metal rings, and all I need to do is just move those keyframes around to match up with my reference. Pretty simple, hey? It's a great way to reuse assets that you've made before and then use them in another project. Okay, so now we're going to move on to our metal text. Now I'm borrowing a lot of this from Kaizen tutorials. You should go watch his tutorial. It goes a lot more in depth, but since we're doing it in this one, I figure I probably need to cover it. So what we're going to do first is add in a plane, and we're going to use our plane to kind of make this dissolving text, and then we're going to use that material and apply it to our text. So go ahead and add in a plane, go ahead and rename it like text dissolve, and then go to the shading editor. So for this, we can just get rid of the ESDF. We don't need it, just delete it. We're going to do our own. We're going to add in a noise texture. Now to separate the noise, I'm going to go ahead and add in something called a math node. I'm going to bring that in, I'm going to set it to less than, and then just going to separate the black from the white. Anything less than that, it's going to be black. Anything above is going to be white. You can see when I move it around, it's going to change kind of the look of that. So I'm going to go ahead and duplicate the less than, but I'm going to change this one to greater than, and then I'm going to go ahead and add those two together. And what's happening is it's kind of like puzzle pieces. One's having blank spots in it, and the other one has the puzzle pieces that'll just sit right on top and just fit together. So when I combine them, I'm just going to have a completely white piece. Now that's not what I want. What I want is a little bit of an edge. So what I need to do is subtract just a tiny amount from the less than node. I just move that less than threshold a little bit. It'll give me an edge. Now I'm going to show you something new here because there's an easier way to see what's going on. To do that, we're going to activate an add-on called Node Wrangler. This is used basically by everybody all the time. So to do that, we go to Edit, go to Preferences, and then if we go to Add-on, we can just search for it, Node Wrangler. And I already have it turned on. If you don't, go ahead and click this checkbox. And then you don't need to do anything. You don't need to install it. It's already installed. You just have to activate it by checking that box. Exit that. Now, if we Control-Shift-Click on any of our nodes, it'll bring that up in the viewer so we can see it. So with that, we can go ahead and click on my original, our greater than, which is the opposite, and then go ahead and click on the combine. And like I said, it's just kind of like puzzle pieces fitting into slots. They're just coming together. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add in something to drive both values. If I change one, I want to change the other. I don't want them to separate and get apart. So I'm going ahead and add in a value node. So now that I can use that value node to drive what's going on with the rest of it. And I want those reversed, so I'm going to go ahead and hold Control and right click across them to cut them. Now I'm going to switch them. So then I'm going to go ahead and add in a subtract so that I have a little bit of an edge in there. I'm going to subtract the less than from the greater than. And again, if the difference was 0, it would just be all white because they would fit perfectly together. All right, so now we're going to take all that and we're going to mix it with an emission shader. The emission shader is just going to add in that glow. We've done this before. It's really hard to control that value. Anything outside of 0 and 1 will just give you really weird values. You can go ahead and add in another math node, make it a multiply, put it like at 0.1, and then when you actually move that value, you can move it a lot easier. Now I'll need to add in a few more things. We'll need a transparent shader that we need to mix in as well because we want transparent. It needs to dissolve and disappear. And remember, it's not actually going to show because our default mode for materials is opaque. So let's go ahead and change that. And you may notice one problem is white will be opaque, black will actually be transparent, and we have the opposite going on right now. So what we need to do is we need to go ahead and add in an invert to change that around. You can go ahead and change that. That's going in the wrong input. We need that to go into the factor. And as you can see, it's actually all black now. So we need to change one thing around. We need to go ahead, grab that less than, and go ahead and plug that into our second input there. And now we have a separation between the black and the white. And now it's broken because I do this poorly. So I'm going to fix that, and I'm going to tell you what the actual setup is. And I realized my mistake here. My mistake here was the last thing. I plugged it into the wrong mix shader. I need to put it into the farther one. That first mix shader is going to be reserved for our actual material. So the metal material is actually going to plug into that one. So I need to move this less than to the farther one, and now it works correctly. And here's one of the problems with Blender is your nodes get super messy and overlap. It's not pretty. I don't like it, but it is the way that it is. And there's one more thing that's broken. So let's go ahead and fix that. I see my mistake here. It's I actually put the subtract on the greater than instead of the less than. So I just need to move that. And now everything's working the way it's supposed to. Take a screenshot. Use that. All right, so we have our black and white, we have our edge. Now we have that inverted. Now we add in our emission and then our transparent. And we have everything working the way it's supposed to. And we have that one slot open for our metal material. All right, now that we have that made and working correctly, I want to make sure that this texture is going to work on whatever I put it on. Right now it's on a flat plane. That's not going to work if I put it on text or something. It's going to have weird edges. So to make sure that it wraps around anything that I put it on, I'm going to need to add in the texture coordinates. With Node Wrangler enabled, I can just click on this noise texture and hit Control T, and then that'll add in the mapping and texture coordinates. Now these may look familiar. If we go back to our world here, you can see these are the exact same two nodes that we had to add in manually. With Node Wrangler enabled, you can go ahead and just hit Control T on whatever you need to add it to, and you don't even have to remember what the nodes are. All right, so I'm going to go back to my object mode. I'm going to go ahead and grab all these nodes and make them into a group. I don't need my input or output, so I'll grab everything else, hit Control G, that'll simplify it, and it'll put it in a group. You may not know that we are in a group, but if I go over to this little tab here, I can back out of it. And then to get back in, I just click on this little icon in the corner and I'm back in. So now if you see this little group input node, these are values that we can plug into it so that we can access them on the outside. You'll notice when we add in a bunch of nodes that the little toolbar on the side doesn't have all the values for all the nodes, but here we can plug in the values that we want, and then we'll be able to access them when we're not in the shading editor. So maybe we'll want to change the scale or change the roughness or maybe even the color. So I'm just going to go ahead and plug in a bunch of those inputs. We're also going to want to plug in our texture value here. So this is going to be our metal, so we'll want to put that on the outside. And if I need to change any of these values, I can hit N on the keyboard, just like it does in the other window. It'll bring up this little toolbar. Now if I go under group, I can rename some of those values to something a little bit better, like dissolve instead of just value. So now that I have this node group, I can just copy and paste this into whatever material I need to put it in. So I'm going to copy it and then I'm going to paste it into my text material. So I can go ahead and turn off everything else. I can go ahead and hide that plane. I don't need it for anything anymore because I have my material. Now I can just copy and paste that in, and I need to mix the two, the metal and the dissolve, but I don't actually need a mix shader because I have a mix shader within that node group. So all I need to do is open up my node group, and then I need to grab this input here and just connect it so I have it on the outside. You could have done this earlier, I just forgot to do it. Now we can go ahead and take that and plug it right in. And now we're mixing between these two. Again, go watch Kaizen's tutorial on this. It's a lot better, but this will get you started. It's in the template. Now we need to move on to the particles coming off. Now here's where you have to actually make a decision. Because we have to generate particles, we can only do that on a mesh. We can't do that on the text here. Text is not a mesh, so we can't use that. We're going to have to convert our text into a mesh, which means it's locked into place. It's now an object. We can't just go in and change the text. So go ahead and duplicate your text. Go ahead and hide it because we only need one. Grab the one that you want to convert. Right click, go to convert to mesh. Now you can see we have some extra options here. We have this particles tab that we didn't have before. Now we can go on that and we can add in a particle system. I'm going to go ahead and crank up the particles to 10,000. There's going to be a bunch of them. Let's go ahead and call our particle system dissolve. Now, interestingly enough, you're not going to be able to see anything. And the reason is we're not in the right frame range. If you look at our frame range, we have it starting on frame 1. It ends at 200. So we don't have any particles down on this end. So I need to look at my reference. It looks like they come on around 950 and they disappear by about 1050. So I'm going to change that. I'll leave lifetime alone. You can see they all dump on the floor, and that's because gravity is turned on. So I'm going to go down to field weights and I'm going to turn off gravity. Now you can see they kind of disperse. It's really nice. Now we need to make particle shapes. So let's go ahead and put in an icosphere as our particle shape. I'm going to turn it down its subdivisions all the way down. Let's go ahead and name it like dissolve particle so we know what it is. And then I'm going to go back to my particles. I'm going to put in a little bit of randomness in the lifetime. What I really want to change down here is under render. We want to change the scale. It's way too big right now. We can turn that down. I don't want to show the emitter. When we're done, we just want the particles. The emitter is going to be this icosphere that we have here. So we're going to disable that because we don't want it rendered out. Let's go ahead and put in a material. Let's go ahead and go to our shading tab. Let's rename it like dissolve particle. We don't need this principal shader. We can just delete that. We're going to replace it with an emission shader. And I'm just going to add in a mix shader and a transparent, just because if we want to make it a little bit transparent or fade it off. Right now it's still set to halo, so we need to go down under that render system. We need to change it to object. And then using this little eyedropper here, I'll just turn back on my particle real quick so I can grab it. Now we've replaced those spheres with this particle. So there we have our particles. Now they're flying out. They're looking pretty good. They're still a little too big. If you need to scale them down even more, you can also just turn on the particle itself and we'll just scale that down. Now I can just hit H to hide it again. If we want to control this a little bit more, we can add in some forces. So you hit Shift A, you can go ahead and add in some wind. Shooting the wrong direction from what I would assume it is, so I'm going to go over to its parameters. It's negative right now. I'm just going to make it positive. You can see that now it's blowing them the other direction. I can add in a second one and we can kind of curve it, change its value a little bit. Now that we have our particles moving in roughly the way we want it to, we can go ahead and go back to that dissolve. So I'm going to go to frame 950. I'm going to have that start dissolving. Remember, we have that dissolve parameter and we can just keyframe that to bring our text from being all the way on to dissolving off. And while that's happening, the particles are generating. So it looks like it's turning into all these little dust particles. And you can go back and add in some more forces to get the particles moving the way you want to get a better look. There's lots of there in the list. I ended up using a couple of wind and a turbulence to kind of get them mixing together. So one thing to note is this particle system needs to calculate in Blender. So make sure you run through all your frames so it can play back smoothly. And even a better option is to go ahead and bake it. What bake does is basically render the particle simulation so that it doesn't have to calculate it anymore. The particles are going to move in this path every time. You can still change parameters after that, like color or your size or whatever it is. Just the motion is going to be baked in. So I recommend baking it before you render out the whole thing. And if you don't remember to play through it or bake it, you can get errors in when you actually render it out. Like there will be missing particles that aren't calculated. There will be skip frames. Particles will be there 1 second and then gone and then back on again. So make sure you do that step. It's really important. Otherwise you'll get a really faulty render. A few things to note before we render this out. I did make a change to the text here because it didn't look right, didn't match up quite the way I wanted it to. I changed to console as regular, and you can see it matches up with my reference a lot better than the original Corbel did. I did end up leaving Corbel for the normal text though. And then there was one technical issue that I needed to fix. When you go through here and you look at your text, if you look at the glass, it's casting kind of like this transparent shadow. So the way I fixed that is I just changed our blend mode from alpha hash to alpha blend. So if you're running into that problem, go ahead and switch that. All right, now we can render it out and see what the whole thing looks like together. Still have some stuff to do. We need to add in this comet. We need to add in this atmosphere and these particles. We're going to do that in the next video. For now, we're going to leave it here. Thank you for watching. Remember to do some dabbling of your own, and I'll see you next time.